The ancient land of Kintyre is defined by the sea and the lochs that surround it.
When people travelled by boat and the seaways of the west were king, Kintyre was well connected to Scotland's big centres of population and industry. But surprisingly, with the rise of the car, the lochside communities began to feel increasingly remote.
Lochs are Scotland's gift to the world, a product of an element that we have in spectacular abundance: water. With so much of the wet stuff, it's not surprising that there are tens of thousands of lochs in Scotland, and they come in all shapes and sizes. Long fjord-like sea lochs, great freshwater lochs of the central Highlands, and a multitude of lochans that stud the open moors. In this series, I'm on a loch-hopping journey across Scotland, meeting the people who live close to their shores and discovering how lochs have influenced an entire nation. For this grand tour, I'm exploring the communities around Scotland's longest sea loch, Loch Fyne. My journey begins on the shores of Campbeltown Loch, heads north up the Kilbrannan Sound, chases ghostly shoals of herring to Tarbert, then races from Loch Gilphead across Loch Fyne to a geological marvel. This is the famous Campbeltown Loch, renowned for many things, especially whisky, and guarding the entrance to the loch, the tiny Davaar Island.
To get to Davaar Island, you can either take a boat across or wait until low tide and walk across.
Heading across the tidal land bridge, I see ahead of me a strange figure making towards the island. A place of mystery and imagination, and the setting for a miraculous visitation.
The mystery of Davaar Island reached public attention back in 1887 when a local newspaper announced to the world the discovery of a curious painting in a dark cave.
According to the paper, a yachtsman who had rowed ashore and had wandered into the cave struck a match to light his pipe. What he saw in its flickering light caused him to faint on the spot. The face of Christ. But it wasn't an apparition, it was a painting, and it's still here. Entering the cave, I can see for myself the extraordinary spectacle of the crucified Christ, and perched on a rock below it, the artist Ronnie Tonieri.
Now this really is an extraordinary religious image. What's the story behind it, Ronnie?
Well, it started in 1887. A guy called Archibald McKinnon from Campbeltown. He was a local art teacher, young man, be about 30. And he later claimed to have had a dream in which he saw this sea cave with a painting of Christ on the wall, and went out in secret and painted it over several weeks, didn't tell anyone. And it was discovered accidentally. People thought that it was the work of the Almighty. There's divine intervention at work here.
A miracle had happened here at Davaar.
The Open Times wrote a glowing review of the painting, praising its artistic merit.
The newspaper article opened a floodgate of visitors. Thousands flocked to see the miraculous painting. Some thought it would be the making of Campbeltown.
They thought that this was going to be as big a tourist draw as the Eiffel Tower or the pyramids. They would get going a wee bit over the top in the local Argyllshire Advertiser.
They could see pound
signs. Yes,
signs.
they could see that. And then someone discovered that it was McKinnon, or he admitted it. I'm not quite sure what.
Just a local boy.
Yeah.
The mood changed. The painting was condemned as a fraud, and the scandalised town turned against McKinnon, who fled to England. But eventually, Campbeltown began to appreciate the worth of the painting and invited McKinnon home to restore his now faded artwork.
He came back in 1902 and repainted it, because the first version, which you can see here, that he did, was very simple, rather naive.
It's a
but
primitive
strong.
interpretation,
Yes,
isn't it?
it's strong. And then this is McKinnon himself.
Is this him standing behind?
And that's him in his good suit. He had his paintbrushes tied to his walking stick.
Sadly, none of McKinnon's original work has survived. But in what seems to have become a tradition, successive art teachers from Campbeltown Grammar School have painted their own versions of the crucifixion, one replacing the other as the originals faded in the damp conditions. In the 1970s, it was Ronnie's turn. The present painting is his second rendition.
What was it like making your own interpretation of this work?
I think if I were doing it again, and I might have to in my 80s like McKinnon, because he came back in 1934 and did his final version of it, I think I would try and go back to his original one. I think the concept itself is a work of genius to actually conceive of this painting in this particular wall in this cave.
Well, it stands as a remarkable testimony to the dedication of, what, 4 generations of art teachers from Campbeltown.
Yes.
I think it's a work of genius myself, Ronnie. I think it's fantastic. And a brilliant setting.
Leaving Ronnie, I retrace my steps ahead of the incoming tide and head up the Loch to Campbeltown, famous the world over for whisky. Being in Campbeltown today, it's hard to imagine the importance of whisky to the success of the town. But this old photograph, which was taken around the turn of the last century, shows some of the activity, with tall chimneys dominating the scene. The whisky produced here is in a class of its own, making Campbeltown one of Scotland's 5 unique whisky districts. Today, there are just 3 remaining distilleries: Glen Scotia, Springbank and Glengyle. But during the glory days, Campbeltown was known as Whiskyopolis, producing industrial quantities of spirit from coal-fired distilleries. And the whisky that flowed was exported around the world. But success came at a price. Quality suffered and sales began to decline. The secret element behind all this boom and bust was this stuff, coal. Now, coal, of course, was the key ingredient in Scotland's industrial revolution, and by far the bulk of it was found in the central lowlands. But uniquely, in the Highlands, the coal that was burned in Campbeltown was mined locally, and coal means steam. On the trail of Argyll's only coal mine, this old map shows the route of a railway line to the former pithead. It ran from Campbeltown to Machrihanish, although there's little to see today. But until 1960, it was also possible to take a steam passenger train known as the Machrihanish Express. Now that would have been fun. Unlikely as it may seem, Journey's End is a caravan park. It's hard to imagine that coal was ever mined here, but the history of coal extraction at Machrihanish is a long one, dating back to 1492, when enterprising monks had a mine not far from here. The last mine closed in the 1960s. To help me dig up the past are ex-miners George and Willie Macmillan.
Gentlemen, we're sitting here in the middle of a caravan park, but of course, go back 50 years, you would have seen a completely different scene.
Oh, aye. The last pit, the one that Willie and I worked in, closed here in 1967.
How many men were employed here?
At one time, it was just under 400. That included everybody, surface people, electricians and all that sort of thing.
Was it good money?
Well, depending on what you're at, you'd wait your turn to get to the coal face. You more or less had to wait until somebody died.
Right.
Isn't that right, George?
Ah, there were a few waiting on me going.
I'm still waiting on you.
a long wait.
So was that the best paid job then, at the coal face itself?
Oh, aye. Oh, definitely, aye.
Was it dangerous work?
Well, you probably would class it dangerous. We got used to it. It was just natural to us. The big thing about being in the pit, being downstairs, everybody had to do their job properly because you're depending on the man next door to do his job so that the roof didn't come on you, sort of style. So it was a team effort. You had to look after everybody there, you know.
Now, This, Willie, is a formidable looking weapon. Is that the kind of pick that would have been used by the likes of yourself when you were down the pit?
That's exactly it. The point was like a needle.
Was it really?
You could split a big lump of coal just with that.
Wow.
That was good. It's a good tool.
Sometimes miners' tools didn't perform as well as they should. When George was alone on watch one Hogmanay, his headlamp failed.
You don't understand what darkness means to you doing a pit. There's nothing at all. It's just complete darkness. So anyway, I sort of just got down to my hands and knees and I crawled back out. There was rails for taking in the pit products and stuff, so I just got them on each side and I took my way out. I was the only person in the pit. Nobody else there with me.
It must have taken quite a long time.
It took me a wee while right enough, but I always say I went home that night by rail.
Mining has always had a reputation for hardship, and miners have often suffered when the world's economic winds blow chill. This was especially true during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Desperate for heat and warmth, miners started an unlicensed pit at a place called Tirfergus on a hillside overlooking Machrihanish. Local farmer John Armour helps me to read the landscape.
Now, John, I'm looking for the entrance to this mine here, which you can see in this old photograph.
Yeah.
Now, where are we standing at the moment? Are we anywhere near this?
We're standing right above where that was. The entrance is at the bottom of the hill. But it's been covered over with a landslide. And what you see now is where the mine was. This landslide came right down on top of it.
So beneath our feet, there is coal.
There is coal there, yes, and I'm told the seam goes from here right all the way to Northern Ireland. Here we are.
Is that it? Is that the old entrance?
That's what's left of the entrance. The trees have come right down, and obviously over the years the trees have grown a fair bit too, so where there was any sort of sign of it, it's now gone.
It's all collapsed in on itself. And the coal, is there any of that still exposed?
Yeah, there is. There's some down here. There's a seam that's kind of open just at the side of the road here. We can maybe go and have a wee look at it.
See if I can swing this pick.
I'm sure I'll find some.
Is that it?
This is it. That's it, Paul. That's what's left of the seam the whole way to Northern Ireland.
I'm going to swing my pick.
On you go. Give it a go. See what you can get.
So this is it here?
Yes.
Okay. Look at that. Tirfergus coal.
That's Tirfergus coal, yes.
It's rather poor quality, shaly looking coal, is it not?
It's very poor. I think you needs to be burnt at a very high heat to get any benefit from it at all.
But again, it shows just how desperate the men were
Yep,
to
absolutely. Yep.
come looking for this stuff.
We're the first person to have mined coal out of here maybe for the last 80 years.
Well, I'm going to keep that as a souvenir. It might bring me luck.
I think you should, yes.
Maybe for Hogmanay.
That's to get round to your neighbour.
Exactly. That's all he deserves.
Pocketing my lump of coal, I head west towards the long arm of Loch Fyne, passing along the shores of the Kilbrannan Sound between the mainland and the Isle of Arran. The sea lochs and islands here were once dominated by the first Lord of the Isles, Rhi Innes na Gael, otherwise known as Somerled. Half Viking, half Gael, he set himself up in opposition to the King of Scots, but he paid a heavy price. This ambitious warrior overreached himself and died in battle against the royal army in 1164. Tradition has it that he's buried somewhere here at Saddle Abbey, which was built on land he'd granted to the church. But the abbey has been a ruin for centuries, and Somerled's grave was lost long ago. Somerled was the big daddy of Clan Donald, and a recent survey suggests that up to 90% of the 6 million or so MacDonalds across the entire world share his DNA. And it's an intriguing thought that the bones of the great Somerled himself might be mouldering in an unmarked grave somewhere beneath my feet. How the mighty are fallen. Clan Donald and Somerled's descendants lost out to the Campbells, who later replaced them as the power in the land. Despite this, several ancient families descended from Somerled still live in Kintyre, including the McAllisters. This is Torresdale House, home to Neil McAllister Hall and his family.
Neil, how long have your family been associated with Torresdale?
Well, my great-great-grandfather rented the property in the late 1700s, I think it was, and then my great-grandfather bought it in around 1895.
So several generations.
Yeah, I'll be the 5th generation to live here, with my children being the 6th.
But under different circumstances, I imagine, because go back 100 years or so ago, there would have been a lot of people living here.
Oh, very much so. I mean, the whole ground floor would have been domestic servants and cooks, nannies, a butler, and then outside there would have been foresters, shepherds, gamekeepers, so the employees must have been 30 or 40 at least, I would
really?
say.
So it was a really important part of the local economy.
It would have been one of the main employers in the economy, absolutely, at the time.
But things have changed. You don't have a butler anymore.
We certainly don't have a butler, just myself, Emma, and 2 children.
But how do you keep a place that size going?
Well, we've managed to diversify. We run self-catering holiday houses. We put a small hydroelectric scheme in just 2 years ago, and from that we run a gin distillery.
A gin distillery?
Yeah, a gin distillery.
Right. Can I have a look at your gin distillery?
Absolutely, come on,
Nice.
we'll have a gin and tonic.
What excellent idea.
Neil takes me down to the old piggery, where his wife Emma and a group of ladies bottle gin for the home market and for export, all thanks to a modest-sized contraption that takes centre stage.
So this is the business end of your gin production.
This is our 200-litre copper pot still.
So how does that work? You've got the hydropower producing electricity.
The hydropower produces electricity and it feeds into this sort of bain-marie water jacket here, which copper pot sits on top. So there's 4 electrodes, 4 immersions that basically heat up the water inside this jacket.
Right, so it's an eco-friendly gin.
Eco-friendly gin, green gin, although it's not coloured green, but it's green gin, yes.
So what ingredients do you have in here to produce the taste that you hope people are going to be won over by?
We use 12 botanicals, 10 of which are commonly used in gin, but 2 are special to us, and that's Icelandic moss, which grows on the trees around here. You'll see the fluffy lichen that grows on the birch trees, and we also use sheep sorrel as well, which grows commonly around here.
Right. Have you not just given away a really important secret?
No, we openly advertise that's what we use. People just don't know how much we use.
Ah, I see, the quantity.
So that's, that's the
secret part of the recipe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bearing that in mind, we should move on to taste
Absolutely,
your gin,
Yeah.
which is called Bernard Turk.
Which is our company name, which is Hill of the Wild Boar, from where the power comes from and the water comes from. And our signature gin is called Kintyre gin.
Well, let's give it a whirl, shall we? Sanj.
Cheers.
That's refreshing, isn't it?
That's
On a
good,
day
on a
like
day like
today,
this.
when it's so warm,
Excellent.
I can't think of anything better.
Life here has always been about harvesting natural resources, whether botanicals for gin or riches from the sea. This is Carradale, once a busy fishing port. Loch Fyne was famous for the huge shoals of herring that migrated to its waters annually, attracting dozens of fishing boats to harvest the marine wealth of the loch. In time, a unique system of fishing was developed here, the ring net. The Shemaran is the last type of this traditional boat and is run by the Ring Net Heritage Trust. The skipper today is Sandy Galbraith, whose family once owned this beautiful boat, and he's among the last in a long line of ring net fishermen.
So what was ring net fishing? Was it a technique of fishing?
So it's just to circle the, if that's a shoal there, you drop the net there, right round it like that. But you needed 2 boats. And,
I see, right.
And then you closed it, and the boat who shot the net just pull it in, if you're lucky enough to catch them. Sometimes it's not easy, but...
It must have been very labour intensive as well if you've got 2
well,
boats.
There was 6 men in each boat.
Right, so that's 12 men's livelihood was dependent on that one catch.
Correct, yes. But that's only one shot. You might have six shots during the night.
So you were fishing at night then?
Only at night, yeah.
Why was that?
Well, the herring come up to the surface at night, and that's when the ring net suits.
Right.
Or sometimes you see them in the water as well because they're up on the surface. Because there's phosphorus in the water and it would brighten, you know, if they moved at all, they would brighten up and you see the herring actually swimming and the mackerel as well. That's the things you remember, you see.
Throughout the 60s and the 70s, Sandy and the Shemeron chased the shoals of herring, down Loch Fyne, beyond Arran and Campbeltown, and along the Ayrshire coast. But then the fish disappeared.
What finished off herring fishing in Loch Fyne?
Well, it's partially just got overfished eventually, and they didn't come back again, the herring. You know, they were there for quite a long time, I have to say, but they just got less and less, and that was it. There wasn't enough to, you know, it had to be a seasonal job, and you'd have to go to something else.
It's a shame, really, isn't it, when you think of the huge shoals of herring that at one time came up this loch.
Well, when I went to it first, you get herring everywhere about here, all the way up to Lochgilphead, right down to Skipness, down the Sound, you know, they were everywhere, you know. That was in the 60s, the mid-60s.
And if they came back, would you be tempted to go after them again?
Well,
and chase silver darlings?
Maybe a wee bit late now, but I wouldn't mind seeing it return, to be honest. It'd be good to see it again now.
Before the ringnet fishermen plied these waters, there were the Vikings. They gave my next destination, the village of Tarbert, its name. Tarbert means a place where longships were dragged across a narrow neck of land. Way back in the 11th century, the Norwegian warrior king Magnus Barefoot forced the King of Scots to accept a peace treaty which gave all the land navigable by boat to Norway.
In order to maximise his claim, Magnus Barefoot had his war galley dragged across the narrow neck of land that separates West Loch Tarbert from East Loch Tarbert, which you can see on the map here is no distance at all. So having navigated and sailed his craft from shore to shore, he was able to claim the Kintyre Peninsula for himself. Now, I think that Magnus was doing more than just bending the rules here. I think that he was taking the proverbial, and the Scots king was too weak to do anything about it. And for a while at least, Tarbert remained part of the Viking world.
Heading north, I follow the coast from Tarbert, passing through the village of Ardrishig at the eastern end of the Crinan Canal, and then on to a wide, shallow bay. This is Loch Gilp, and the town that overlooks it is Loch Gilphead, the administrative centre for the county of Argyll. Surprisingly, this lochside town was the location for a spectacular and unlikely chapter in the history of the Scottish car industry. It was here in the 1980s that the super sports car, the Argyll Turbo GT, was born.
I remember a press report in the Oban Times announcing the launch of the Scottish supercar, and a photo shoot with the Duke and Duchess of Argyll, no less. Now, it made quite a splash, but that was almost 40 years ago. And since then, the fate of the Argyll GT has become something of a mystery.
Following a few clues and armed with an old address, the trail leads to an unlikely location on the edge of town.
Now, this looks promising. Argyll Turbo Cars Limited. What's in here?
Here I meet Bob Henderson, the man behind the legendary Argyll.
Nice to see you. And even nicer to see this. It's fantastic. This is the Argyll GT, the fabled Argyll GT.
It is indeed.
In all its glory.
Yep.
Now, Bob, I'm guessing the market that you were entering was pretty kind of tightly packed with some pretty powerful supercars at the time, like Maseratis.
Yeah, but they were big money.
Yeah?
We reckon we could do it for a heck of a lot less than that. And a lot of the stuff we could build ourselves economically here in Lochgilphead and didn't have to sort of buy silly and expensive things from other people. So we were pretty independent here, even though we're pretty remote in the hills. Nobody thought it was possible.
You wouldn't think it was possible to build a car like this in Lochgilphead.
Bob is a man full of surprises. He tells me that the inspiration for the Argyll came from his earlier pioneering work with turbochargers.
It evolved originally, I suppose, because we were in the tuning and modification of other people's cars, and that led us to being the first people doing turbocharging.
So you were producing turbochargers here?
Yeah, we were the first to do turbocharging on petrol engines in the world.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
So the turbocharging came first, and then the car came after that?
Yeah, and that then took us from ordinary car, if you like, into supercar power outputs.
The supercar that Bob and the team developed in the early 1980s is truly remarkable. It still looks futuristic, yet glories in imperial measurements, being 15 feet 4 inches long and 6 feet wide. The V8 engine develops a whopping 250 brake horsepower.
What's going to happen with this car now? I mean, is it running?
Everything except the engine, yes. It got left under a leaking gutter for many months. So I'm seriously thinking of taking the engine out and either rebuilding it or I've got a spare engine in there. And this one only has a 4-speed gearbox and the other's got a 5. I should probably do a few miles on it to remind myself what it was like in the good old days.
Well, I think it's a work of genius and so surprising to see such an extraordinary machine born in such humble surroundings. Superb. I think it's a wonderful machine.
Leaving Bob to tinker with his turbo, I hit the road and make my way up the western shore of Loch Fyne to a forgotten coastal village called West Otter Ferry. Only the ruins of the houses remain of this once busy place, which was a ferry terminus for goods and passengers crossing the loch to the eastern shore. The last occupant of the ferryman's cottage left in 1948, ending a tradition that went back centuries. To recreate this forgotten crossing, I'm being ferried over in a modern rib.
In 1791, the fare recorded to cross the loch was 3 pence for a man and 9 pence for a horse, which sounds reasonable, but when you think about it, it was probably the equivalent of a day's wages.
Perhaps it would have been worth it, though, to avoid a massive detour around the head of the loch. Landing on the opposite shore, I find myself at the tiny village of Otter Ferry, which surprisingly has little to do today with ferries or otters.
Although you can see otters down here from time to time, the word otter in Otter Ferry is actually the corruption of a Gaelic word, otter, spelt O-T-T-I-R, which refers not to the animal lutra lutra, but to a gigantic spit of sand and gravel that stretches almost across the loch.
Seen from the air, the otter is dramatic. It extends for almost 1.5 kilometres and nearly cuts Loch Fyne in two. It was formed thousands of years ago during a glacial advance, when the snout of a glacier stopped here, dropping debris that almost created a land bridge. But beware, the otter is a tidal feature, appearing and disappearing with each ebb and flow.
Now, I followed the otter almost as far as I dare. Now, this is not a place to linger, especially when the tide is coming in, which is what it's doing at the moment. But what a spectacular location. I'm in the middle of Loch Fyne, making this the perfect place to end my grand tour of Scotland's lochs.